Two world wars tore the heart out of the 20th century. They are a rent in the fabric of history. One world before, another after. Between these two tragedies, a mere 20 years. 20 years of peace that produced war. Peace that failed. Impossible peace. The sad shuttle diplomacy of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain is often used to illustrate the age and the word appeasement, to damn it.
When he arrives in Germany, when he arrives in Munich, on the third visit, again, lines and lines of crowds are there to meet him. He's completely treated to these great crowds of those who see him as the savior of peace.
The British Premier goes straight to the Führer House where the fateful conference is to take place. He walks up the steps with von Ribbentrop deep in thought. It is 2 o'clock in the morning, and agreement has been reached. Hitler signed. Then the signature of the prime mover in the negotiations, the Prime Minister, goes on to the document. Peace is safe.
Adolf Hitler had got the Sudetenland and claimed it was the end of his territorial ambitions. But it was not. The Anschluss exposed Czechoslovakia. The occupation of Czechoslovakia would outflank Poland. This was a plan, not a random series of grand larcenies. And if it was a plan, what must follow was blindingly obvious. Except to the blind. Appeasement is remembered as the failure of liberal democracy through the incompetence of an old man summed up in a wing collar and a windy airfield. And perhaps it was all of that.
We regard the agreement signed last night as symbolic of the desire never to go to war with one another again.
The big newsreel companies were complicit with the policy of appeasement and presented and projected Chamberlain as the hero of the peace.
To the Prime Minister, the agreement of Munich is only a beginning. Our words of admiration and thanks are exhausted for the man who averted another Armageddon.
Three weeks prior to traveling to Munich to meet the Führer, Neville Chamberlin had written that he thought Hitler was half mad. So he knew. Alfred Hitchcock made a film exactly contemporary with Munich, in which some see him signifying his view of appeasement.
The moment in The Lady Vanishes where Cecil Parker comes out of the carriage waving his white handkerchief and then being shot by the police, which was a film released bang on the time of the Munich crisis, and which became a moment which came to be read as a kind of allegory of appeasement.
Many who oppose appeasement were vociferous, and they were immediate in their criticism. A writer named Robert Riedel was responsible for an article that appeared in The Nation on March the 12th, 1938, under the title Chamberlain's Treason. In it, Dell excoriated the successful bluff and blackmail of the fascist powers on the one hand, and the incapacity and poltroonery of the Western democratic powers on the other.
The writing on the wall is in the wake of the Munich agreement, really. That's the point when Hitler doesn't just take a territory that was taken from Germany at the Paris Peace Conference, but in fact starts to annex things that are beyond what was agreed at the Paris Peace Conference. That's where you know that this man's shopping list just continues and you're on it.
The argument that Chamberlain bought time is not supported by the facts. Britain grew stronger. Germany grew stronger still. The French parodied Chamberlain as Monsieur Chamberlin, Mr. I Love Berlin. But we should remember, when Prime Minister Daladier returned from Munich expecting to be booed for the sellout, he was cheered to the rafters.
There's a famous story of him expecting to be lynched because he sold out to Hitler, and instead the crowds are cheering at the airport because he's brought back peace for a few more months. He comes out and he says, "Les cons," the idiots.
The reason was simple. The world breathes again, said the newspaper Parisois. We can all live. Hoping to be the strong leader that he thought the British wanted to stand up to the strong men on the continent, Oswald Mosley, inveterate party hopper, led the British Union of Fascists. Mosley was a notorious philanderer. It is said that his private motto, combining social conscience with rampant libido, had been vote Labour, sleep Tory. The peace in Germany was shattered less than 2 months after Munich, when Hitler, disturbed perhaps by the German people's celebration of Munich as a guarantee of peace, unleashed a fearsome pogrom. November the 10th has come to be known as Kristallnacht. The violence should not have been revelatory, but it was. And some in Westminster now saw that more than a power struggle was in play. This was a moral struggle. No more Munichs for me, said Lord Halifax. Kristallnacht made it crystal clear that persecution of the Jews was not off-the-cuff hooliganism. It was an expression of state policy. An underreported decree of August the 17th supremely characterizes both the absurdity and cruelty of the race laws. From that date, all Jewish men were by law to call themselves Israel, and all Jewish women to add the name Sarah to their forename. Why would seem to be the only necessary question.
The newsreels did not really want controversy. They did not see that as a part of their job. They were covering fashion parades, they were covering sporting events, they were covering non-controversial issues. But in the week after Kristallnacht, Fox, Movietone News and the other newsreel companies, they covered Kristallnacht.
Some in America did follow and respond to events elsewhere.
Was it any wonder that in America, the home of liberty, the champions of freedom should stage one of the most sensational public protests ever witnessed in the streets of New York?
After Kristallnacht, Fiorella LaGuardia, mayor of New York, organized a 12-man police detail to guard the German consulate in his city. It was made up entirely of Jewish officers under the command of Captain Max Finkelstein. In France, the election of Léon Blum's Second Popular Front produced a government that lasted only 26 days.
The French need to pull together with a sort of National Front government, but no one wants to support him apart from the few left-wing people around him. The centre ignore him, the right ignore him, and his government is really pilloried in extreme anti-Semitic terms and doesn't last very long.
The world was moving to the right, and France moved to Edouard Daladier, ringing a final curtain down on the Popular Front's revolution of June 1936. To Mussolini, writing in Popolo d'Italia, Blum was one Jew who did not possess the gift of prophecy. Mussolini's regime had never been better than half-hearted on the subject of race, but as it cozied up to the Reich, it became full-throated.
The regime finds that Italian soldiers, Italian administrators, actually rather like beautiful Ethiopian women and are perfectly capable of having relationships with them. And Mussolini reacts personally, actually, like saying, well, how do I explain this to the British? Real imperial people don't do that sort of thing. And so Italy starts bringing in tougher and tougher legislation.
The publication, Manifesto of Racial Scientists, to which Il Duce himself contributed, contained the statement that the people of Italy are of Aryan origin, which must have surprised many Italians.
Mussolini, grudgingly, by 1938, has to accept that his best chances of success are with going along with this new force.
Through the huge crowd, mysterious in the low glare of the searchlights, runs the thrill of race consciousness as the Latin leader addresses them in their own tongue.
Mit lauter Stimme, Friede!
By the time he received the news of Kristallnacht, Mussolini had so reinvented his racial policy that he could tell Ciano he unconditionally approved of Germany's policy towards the Jews. Legislation was passed mimicking the Nuremberg laws. The first clause prohibited the marriage of an Italian citizen of Aryan race to a person belonging to another race.
Rome is having quite a glut of weddings. The latest is that of the Duce's eldest son, Vittorio, Air Force hero of the Abyssinian War.
Japan had withdrawn from the League of Nations following her invasion of Manchuria. She was now embroiled in full-scale war in China. She faced no sanctions, continued to attend international conferences, and was, until 1938, contributing to League programs. Military expenditure accounted for 75% of the government's budget. And Japanese ambitions were not about to be curtailed. On February the 18th, Japanese planes bombed the provincial capital, to which Chiang Kai-shek had withdrawn his government. As well as explosives, the aircraft dropped propaganda leaflets, including the anti-war, or perhaps more accurately, pro-fascist speeches of Charles Lindbergh, thoughtfully translated into Chinese. In a world of evil places, people, ordinary people, cannot be blamed if they look for escape.
The comic book really emerges in the United States in the late 1930s. But we see a transformation in the content from this sort of funny humour strips to the emergence of adventure stories, and particularly the superhero. The first Superman comics are published in 1938.
By 1938, 70% of the world's screen time was taken up with American movies. In some countries, as much as 95%. And in America, there was not much change from 100%. Movies were made in Hollywood, automobiles were made in Detroit, and that was the natural order of things. The journey of jazz, from fringe to center, perhaps climaxed in January 1938, when Benny Goodman played a concert at Carnegie Hall. Trumpeter Harry James said he felt like a whore in church. On March the 13th, 1938, the day after the Anschluss, CBS inaugurated World News Roundup, which, rather than relying on the wire services, featured live broadcasts from European capitals. In that broadcast, filing from an edgy Vienna that was awaiting Hitler's arrival, was the soon-to-be legendary Edward R. Morrow. It was the real-time urgency of this pioneering reporting that Orson Welles would harness and mimic later in the year. In 1938, Southern senators filibustered for 6 weeks, until on February the 21st, the bill to which they objected was withdrawn. It was an anti-lynching bill. "I believe in white supremacy," declared Louisiana Senator Alan J. Ellender. "And as long as I am in the Senate, I expect to fight for white supremacy." The prospect of large numbers of Jewish refugees prompted President Roosevelt to call an international conference.
The plight of Jewish children driven from Germany has stirred the sympathy and conscience of the rest of the world. For many of these innocents don't even know the whereabouts of their parents, let alone their fate.
The Evian Conference brought 32 nations to Evian-les-Bains to discuss the problem of what it called involuntary immigration. Basically, the Jewish question. Hitler hoped that they would be generous enough to convert this sympathy into practical aid. "We, on our part," he said, "are ready to put all these criminals at the disposal of these countries." After a week of conversation, the delegates recommended that there should meet at London an intergovernmental committee. They formed a committee, and that is all they did. The great benefit of Evian was it allowed more than 30 nations to unite in doing nothing, which was so much less embarrassing than doing nothing on your own. And only a few months of peace remained. On the morning of January the 22nd, Republican General Rojo told his Prime Minister that the Barcelona front had ceased to exist. Prime Minister Negrin, in response, ordered all government departments to abandon the city. 48 hours before the entrance of the enemy, wrote General Rojo, Barcelona was a dead city. When the French government opened the border on January 28th, 200,000 people crossed. Thousands of others made their unchecked escape over the Pyrenees. On January the 31st, President Roosevelt spoke to senators who were about to vote on a bill that would authorize the purchase of thousands of aircraft for the Army Air Corps. His topic was how to deal with Hitler, and he said, "There isn't any use calling him a nut because he is a power, and we have to recognize that." On February the 27th, the British and French governments formally recognized the nationalist government in Burgos. On March the 6th, what had been the government left Spain aboard 3 Douglas aircraft. On the 26th, the final nationalist advance began. On March the 31st, the Nationalist Army reached the last of its objectives.
When Republican resistance collapsed, Franco's supporters in Madrid came out into the open to welcome the conquerors. Amazing how the extended arm replaced the clenched fist overnight.
and Pope Pius XII sent a message to Franco giving sincere thanks for the victory of Catholic Spain. Ciano, Mussolini's foreign minister, praised a formidable victory for fascism, the greatest one so far. Some 10,000 people were killed, executed, murdered in the first 5 days following the nationalists' entry into the capital. On May the 19th, a grand victory parade in Madrid trooped along the Castellana, renamed Avenida del Generalissimo, in honor of Generalissimo Francisco Franco et Caudillo, the man H.G. Wells called a murderous little Christian gentleman.
The biggest impact for Britain was that Hitler and Mussolini's attempt to expose the limits of appeasement effectively had been successful. The balance of power in Europe had actually shifted against Britain and France.
Following Franco's victory in the Spanish Civil War, President Roosevelt admitted to his cabinet that his Spanish policy had been a mistake and arms should have been supplied to the Republican government to allow Spain to fight for her life and, he added prophetically, for the lives of some of the rest of us as well, as events will like prove. They did. Defeat, not victory, was shaping Japanese policy. The crushing loss to Zhukov's Red Army on the Mongolian border at Nomonhan. Japan lost more troops than the Soviets in the ratio of 5 to 1. And the Soviet-German non-aggression pact, signed on August 23rd, hugely strengthened the hand of the Strike South faction. Those in the military who believed that Japan's territorial expansion should be south into Asia-Pacific rather than north through China. When the Japanese sued the USSR for peace following their defeat, Stalin said, "They have understood my language."
If you look at what Japanese contemporaries were really saying and writing through much of the 30s, what really comes out is this sense of vulnerability. Now, we can say that it's an imagined vulnerability, it's not necessarily real vulnerability, but to them it is very real.
In February 1939, a new commercial treaty bound Germany and Italy together. Among its provisions was the transfer of 500,000 Italian guest workers to the Reich. And on May the 22nd, Germany and Italy signed the Pact of Steel. The Italians signed on the strength of a promise by Ribbentrop that the Führer wanted peace for 5 years. But all of Ribbentrop's promises were written on water. To bolster sliding self-esteem, Italy performed the bully's trick of picking on the feeblest fellow in the room. In this case, Albania.
Italy always invades Albania on a religious day. They'd invaded it on Christmas Day 1914. Under the Liberals, they come back in on Good Friday 1939 and again establish a curious regime, it always seems to me, because they don't want to have a final solution to the Albanian problem or something or other. They don't want to murder all the Albanians. They rather want to turn the Albanians into an Albanian fascist movement.
An Italian destroyer arrives at Durazzo, escorting troop ships taking part in the invasion of Albania. These are the first authentic pictures of this world-shaking event. They depict the scene much as we had imagined it, columns penetrating the country from several landing points.
It was cowardly, meaningless, and its clumsiness exposed Italian military might as being, in the words of Foreign Minister Ciano, a tragic bluff.
Looks as if he's halted the entire column. No, it's a native giving eggs away that's causing the delay. And this is how Italy's gobbling up Albania.
It was the cost of Italy's Spanish entanglement. An unaffordable 8.5 billion lira, 12,000 wounded, 157 destroyed tanks, and 3,819 dead that was bleeding out the country.
Large amounts of equipment were left behind when the Italians left Spain. And it has been calculated by military experts that if Italy had had that equipment when it was at war with the British in North Africa, that Italy might well have won.
On March the 3rd, Hitler announced that German forces would move to occupy Prague and eliminate the Czech state in 5 days. When a fearfully browbeaten Czech president ordered Czech troops not to resist the German invaders, failure to do so, Goering had told him, would mean bombs falling on his historic capital. Hitler announced to his secretaries, "I will go down as the greatest German in history." The Führer shouts for joy, noted Goebbels. But Mussolini complained, "The Italians will laugh at me. Every time Hitler takes a country, he sends me a message." He found consolation with his much younger mistress, Claretta Petacci.
Mussolini finds time to ring Claretta a dozen times a day. His record is something like 21. And I do wonder how many other CEOs manage lives like that.
The Spanish Civil War ended in March 1939, and so did Czechoslovakia. The one with the fall of Madrid, the other with the predictable German contempt for a small piece of paper. Hardly anyone watched Hitler's entry into Prague, but thousands cheered his return to Berlin. With the occupation of the whole of Czechoslovakia, Germany acquired a shield and a launching pad which, the Germans hoped, would put pressure on the still unyielding Poles in the matter of Danzig and the Polish corridor, one of the more inept lines scratched on the map of Europe at Versailles. The invasion of the whole of Czechoslovakia demolished the policy of appeasement and united a country of previously divided opinion.
The fate of Czechoslovakia inspires concern among peoples as well as governments, and the crowds proceed to the Czech legation to express their sentiments.
The British people and their politicians at last understood what they were facing. On March the 18th, the British cabinet formally endorsed the change of policy. On March the 20th, according to the minutes, Neville Chamberlin told Cabinet that the government must be prepared to act not in order to save a particular victim, but to pull down the bully. And on March the 31st, Chamberlain rose in the House to pledge to Poland all support in Britain's power. It was recognized at the time as a significant statement. It was, as it turned out, momentous.
March 1939, that's when the last radar pole goes up. And therefore Britain, they hope, will at least have an advance notice if anything happens. They now have some protection.
Why did Chamberlain abandon Czechoslovakia and 6 months later make a pledge to Poland? Because in those 6 months, Hitler had broken his promise. He'd occupied Prague in March and shown himself to be no gentleman. In this climate of fevered uncertainty, many nostrums were proposed. If only Hitler and Mussolini could have a good game of bowls once a week in Geneva, claimed Captain R.G. Bristow, Member of Parliament. I feel that Europe would not be as troubled as it is. The pledge to defend Poland was made in the full knowledge that a parliamentary subcommittee had advised that Great Britain and France could afford them no direct support by sea, on land, or in the air. Neither, it continued, could Great Britain nor France supply any armaments to Poland. So what would the treaty obligations mean?
The problem was now the Soviet Union felt isolated and threatened, and Stalin started to think about the possibility that maybe the main reason behind this appeasement policy actually is to direct Hitler against the Soviet Union.
For those who could read the clues, it had been predictable. But London and Paris missed the clues found in Stalin's speech to the Party Congress, and the replacement in May of Maxim Litvinov as Commissioner for Foreign Affairs. Litvinov was Jewish. His successor was Vyacheslav Molotov, whose real name wasn't Molotov, which means hammer. If the Soviet Union could be brought into an agreement, something meaningful might be accomplished. But the British were wary, and before their mission, headed by the impressively named Admiral Sir Reginald Aylmer Ranfurly Plunkett Ernle Earl Drax, made any sort of progress, the rug was comprehensively pulled from under them by the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. The delegation seemed to the Russians to advertise the British lack of sincerity. Chamberlain and Daladier had gone to Munich, but asked Molotov, "Who do we get here?" And he answered, "Admiral Nobody."
Von Ribbentrop, leaving Berlin for Moscow, ushers in a new, incomprehensible chapter in German diplomacy. What can Russia have in common with Germany to throw over the peace front, if she had?
Finally, the day came. Molotov and von Ribbentrop got together, and the Nazis and communists signed a pact. It was a betrayal by the communists.
At this moment, the cost of global entanglement arising from imperial reach again distracted London. Although history has all but forgotten the Tientsin incident, in which a Japanese blockade of British interests in northern China exposed the weakness of overextension. Unable to force a backdown, the British negotiated compromise skewed in Japan's favor. That this could have serious consequences was not imagined by the arch-imperialist Winston Churchill. It is inconceivable in our lifetime, and in that of our children, that Japan could pose a threat to the security of the British Empire in the East, he had stated in 1925. In 1939, facing Japan's possible designs on Singapore, he added, with similar reassurance, "There will be no attack in any period which our foresight can measure." Churchill's error did not arise from strategic ignorance or political naivety. It came, as did his relentless opposition to granting India dominion status, from racial prejudice. Neville Chamberlin said that debating Churchill was like arguing with a brass band. "Wars will wash over us," said Greta Garbo in 1939's Ninotchka. "Bombs will fall, but not yet. Let us be happy," she said. "Give us our moment."
It's a very, very funny film. There's a line where they're talking about when Garbo, as the commissar, arrives in Paris for the first time, and the three commissars meet her.
How are things in Moscow?
Very good. The last mass trials were a great success. There are going to be fewer but better Russians.
Which is a terrific line, but actually, you know, if you know what happened in the show trials, which they didn't, to be fair, in Hollywood in 1939, it's not at all funny.
What was motivating the terror in the Soviet Union is more difficult to classify. At the beginning of 1939, the Soviet Census Bureau reported that 17 million people were missing. Then, the census takers were shot. By 1939, the Gulag was the largest employer in Europe and contained up to 10% of the Soviet population. They had an average life expectancy of 1 winter. When Stalin treated with the enemy, he explained the non-aggression pact to the army in a document headed, "What has Comrade Stalin done?" The reason was illustrated by drawings of 2 triangles. In one, the bases were labeled Berlin and Moscow. In the other, Berlin and London. What Comrade Stalin's sophistry had done was elevate Moscow above the coming battle. The opportunity had existed to encircle Germany, but it had been fatally missed. On September the 7th, Stalin said he would have preferred an agreement with the so-called democratic countries. But instead, he signed the non-aggression pact with the Reich. The normally abstemious Hitler, when he received confirmation of the signing, allowed himself a glass of champagne and, "Now Europe is mine," he said. "The others can have Asia." British outrage over the non-aggression pact conveniently forgot that, to Stalin, Chamberlain's Munich piece of paper was a non-aggression pact, seeming to license Germany to go east. Article 1 of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact reads, "Both high contracting parties obligate themselves to desist from any act of violence, any aggressive action, and any attack on each other." Article 2 of the secret additional protocol added agreement on what would happen in the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the areas belonging to the Polish state. And then, on September the 1st, having fabricated a farcical pretext, 1.5 million German soldiers in 67 divisions with air and naval support invaded Poland.
Destruction from the sky hit far and wide. Railroad centers bombed like that one. Polish communications were swiftly disrupted by the air raiding.
German troops had occupied the Rhineland, forced the incorporation of Austria into the Reich, and invaded Czechoslovakia. But not until they invaded Poland were they required to fire a shot. On the 17th, as foreshadowed in the secret protocols, Soviet troops invaded from the east, and Poland was, in Michael Burley's phrase, crucified between 2 thieves.
At the front, Germans and Russians meet. Poland defeated. The Soviets push in to seize a share, and there's a proclamation. The Nazi-communist arrangement of such fateful meaning, the existence of a nation signed away.
And so it was that Adolf Hitler, the political genius, led his country into a war years earlier than he intended, against the vast British Empire that he had tried so hard to befriend, and in alliance with the Soviet Union, which he had for years demonized as the great threat to civilization. A flawed genius, then.
The crisis moves on to its climax. Germany has attacked Poland, and Parliament meets again. If German troops are not withdrawn from Poland, Britain goes to her aid with all the resources at her command.
Ultimatums following Germany's move were issued and ignored. On the 3rd, the war, in a strange way to the relief of many who could now exhale, was declared. And unlike the First World War, no one thought it would be over by Christmas. War then, and at that moment, the day-to-day reality of 500 million people was irreversibly altered.
It's tempting to say, where did it go wrong? Could democracy have survived? I think under the conditions in which they were operating, persistent economic crisis and poverty, constant threats of one kind or another, external threats of one kind or another, deep political and ideological divisions within those countries, it's very difficult to see how you could have produced a functioning democratic continent in the 1920s and 30s.
Everything I have worked for, everything I have hoped for, everything that I have believed in during my public life has crashed in ruins, Neville Chamberlin told the House of Commons. Millions of others like me, said the narrator of George Orwell's 1939 novel Coming Up for Air, have got a feeling that the world's gone wrong. The Europe that took up arms was a very different place to the Europe of 20 years earlier. By 1939, 11 European countries, from Iceland through to Scandinavia to Britain and France, were democracies. 16 were under some form of repressive authoritarian rule. The League of Nations remained in existence throughout, but its fate in memory was sealed as the talking shop that had failed to prevent war.
The League, in the first 10 years of its life, up to 1930, up to the early 1930s, was a hugely successful organisation.
It promotes ideas of international labour cooperation. It promotes the idea that women have rights independent of a nation state. They also promote the idea that children have rights.
It settled 60 disputes. On 2 occasions when states had gone to war, it was enough for the League to tell states to stop fighting.
You've got free trade, you've got democratic elections spreading across large parts of the world, you've got the League of Nations, which, yes, we know the script, it was a big failure. Well, it didn't look like this in the 1920s. It was an extraordinary experiment, and people had invested a lot of hopes into it.
The League of Nations is really the world's first intergovernmental financial and economic arrangement.
The League has been unfairly tainted because it's associated with the failure of its member states. What the League could do depended on its member states. So I think it was a very remarkable organisation, a great experiment.
Talk had failed, goodwill had failed, political will had failed. The peace was lost, and a world of dislocation, dictatorship, and genocide was born. Observers have ransacked the 1930s for lessons about statecraft ever since. It had been, according to the surrealist poet David Gascoigne, writing on New Year's Eve, 1939, a decade of free flags flagrantly torn down by order of macabre puppet orators, the blind leading the blindfolded in the devil's den. Strangely, sadly, and rather foolishly, wrote journalist Malcolm Muggeridge, the 30s drew to a close. There is a word for the overlapping of things. The tiles on a roof, the scales on a fish. The word is imbrication. This has been a story about imbrication. The overlapping of things political, social, economic, military, cultural, casual, serious, and profane. At the heart of the story, but not all of the story, is what the poet T.S. Eliot called the immense panorama of futility and anarchy that is contemporary history. The 20s went sour when, in a flurry, they broke every promise and smashed every dream. New promises and new dreams were supplied, but in 1939, the clever hopes expire, wrote W.H. Jordan, of a low, dishonest decade. At Versailles, Woodrow Wilson had defined the intent of the peacemakers as being to make the world safe for democracy. A decade later, facing the rise of dictators and the success of demagogues, British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin wondered whether the task might not be to make democracy safe for the world. The obvious effect of propaganda and big parades prompted his fellow Tory R.A. Butler, then a junior minister, to say that good government flourishes in the dark. But those days had gone. The Second World War was not a continuation of the first in the sense of aims, objectives, alliances, or cheerleaders. Wilhelmine Germany was not the Third Reich. The USSR was not Tsarist Russia. Both Italy and Japan had changed sides. Where the one sired the other was in the empty vaults of national treasuries. The prospects of peace were, throughout the 20s and 30s, persistently undercut by the cost of the Great War, by debt, deflation, and inflation that tried to pay the debt. Max Warburg, a director of the Reichsbank, and so one responsible for the reckless printing of money, was among those who saw the choice as being whether one wished to stop the inflation and trigger the revolution. He and his colleagues decided that inflation was the lesser evil. But it was not. The chance to make a decent place out of the Great War's bloody mess had come and it had gone. And soon the chance would come again to build up out of an even bigger mess. But that's not this story. This story, about a peace that proved impossible, began when the guns fell silent. It ends as they roar back into life. Not a happy ending.